welcome to the Global Hydrogen interview series, also known to us as the Full Court Press, where we're going to take a rapid fire look at a market that some are calling the new oil of the 21st century. There's still a question mark on that, but that's what it's certainly been labeled increasingly of late. My name is 𝗕𝗂𝗀𝗶𝟐. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence. And with me today is 𝗕𝘂𝘀𝗀𝗵𝗶. He is the executive director at International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, which of course many of us know the shorthand of as 𝗕𝘂𝘀𝗀𝗵𝗏. Tim, thank you very much for joining us all the way from Vancouver.
That's great. Yes, my pleasure. Thank you.
I'll just give a quick overview of the market for those listening, and then I'd be really keen to hear your perspective on what you think is next. So we have around 359 large-scale projects announced globally. There's 131 of which were announced in the first half of this year, which I think is extremely meaningful, especially in a post-COVID, mid-COVID state that different countries are at. And total investments in projects and along the whole value chain amount to around $500 billion up to 2030. Again, these are numbers from the Hydrogen Council, and these are good chunks of change. They're not small figures for this market. And obviously, as the 𝗕𝘂𝗀𝗀𝗲 is a government-to-government organization, and much discussion and work is, of course, on understanding approaches by different countries and regions. I'd be really keen for you to give us an overview of how to take advantage of countries' unique circumstances. I mean, aligning two agendas is very tricky anyway, and that's in an established market. Aligning 21 member countries in an emerging market must have its interesting eyebrow-raising moments as well. So I'd just be really keen to hear from your point of view, just to set the scene essentially of how you look at this.
Yeah, okay. First, before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and 𝗕𝘂𝗀𝗏𝗏 nations here in British Columbia. Yeah, it's very interesting, the dynamics that go on in the conversations and the focus of interest within the 𝗕𝘂𝗀𝗏. And as you mentioned, it is a key criteria is to understand the unique circumstances of each of the members. And so whilst we are 21 countries and the European Commission. In fact, topics and themes of interest, and we can talk a little bit about those in a few minutes, but some countries it's very important and others it's not, and that's fine. So really the role of the 𝗕𝘂𝗀𝗏𝗏 is to facilitate those conversations, help organize discussions, and if there's pieces of work that countries want to undertake together, to understand what the issue is, that's what that's part of our function and role. So we don't fund projects, or anything like that, but we try to collaborate and coordinate across the different governments. And the examples that often you see are the key drivers of energy security, energy stability, and then economic opportunity, and of course the environment. So all the countries have those kind of basic four themes that are driving their policy development issues, but each country weights them differently, and you'll see those coming out in their policy developments, the regulatory approaches that they're taking, the roadmaps that they're developing and putting in place. And so it's a mix of those, and it's understanding. You can't just say, gee whiz, that worked there in Northern Europe, and so let's see how it goes in Asia. No, not at all. So why did it work? What were the underlying principles or drivers? And then what does that mean for our country? So that's the kind of conversations that we hope to strive. And so it's not a monolithic approach. No, it's understanding each other.
And like you say, understanding each other on those four key themes. So we had energy security, stability, energy stability, economic stability, and the environment, which of course are all interlinked as well, though they're certainly not in silos anyway. Just you mentioned there about being able to support countries that want to work together. Are you seeing an uptick in your community of people getting in touch, country representatives getting in touch saying we want to work with X country on X project? You seeing an uptick in that this year? We've already mentioned about how there's been such an uptick in the number of projects coming through the pipeline. Are you seeing the same on the collaborative side?
Yes, I would say from our particular organization on project specific in demonstrating or deploying, not as much. It's more on what's the market framework issues. So for example, we all hope for an extended and internet global trade in hydrogen. So one of the questions we have today is, so what are the trade rules today for hydrogen? What are the tariff rates by the different within the different trading agreements? What are the customs requirements to go into ports? What's the safety regulations? What are the procedures in importing and exporting of hydrogen or hydrogen's carriers? And so that's one of the things that we're working on right now, is just what is the playing field today? And if you need to provide certification per ton of hydrogen that's being imported somewhere, okay, if it's a few tons, okay. If it's millions of tons, then okay, this might be an issue. So that's an example of where we are looking to try and understand. It's not any one project, is to say, okay, this is, as governments, we need to understand what the trade regime could look like and what are the issues today, and are there things that we should be addressing as government officials going forward to make sure that it's relatively fluid in the future. So that's one example.
I've read a couple dozen at least national hydrogen reports, national hydrogen strategies. Some of them are very basic, a few pages of intentions. This is our anticipated demand. We definitely want to be involved, and it's a lot simpler. And others are really detailed, giving ideas of financing, production as well, transport, a much bigger picture and intentions when it comes to international alliances as well. Even upskilling has been mentioned in a couple of them as well. So, I'm excluding the EU from this for obvious reasons, though countries within the EU I am referring to, but not the kind of the overarching picture. And it's just been really interesting reading all those to see the differences and thinking that it would benefit so greatly from having a common metric system. I know it's early days, and such metrics and quantifiable setups tend to come a little bit along the way once sentiment is revved up and so on. But it sounds similar to what you're saying, in the sense that to help give that market transparency and to boost that level of visibility, really, that having a lot more clarity on the frameworks via more metrics of, you mentioned about customs and going to ports, and greater transparency on how different ports can manage that. And obviously it's a huge, that in itself is a huge question. It's not a quick answer. So I'd be keen to know from you, how important do you think that development of those metrics are, and how soon do you think, so the metrics within the frameworks, and how soon do you think we can start seeing a lot more progress?
Well, I guess a question around metrics. There's kind of two angles that you could take on that. One is it's important to understand the progression that's going on globally for deployments and production, for example, of hydrogen and its carriers. And so just recently, the IEA came out with its global hydrogen review, and so there's some data and information provided there on both your reference to projects, roadmaps, what is happening there. And so that is starting to come to fruition. And as it develops, vehicle deployments, station deployments under the hydrogen energy ministerial, there's some actions around tracking numbers as well. So that's on one track of the metrics. In the IPHE, for example, one of the key issues around market transparency is the GHGs associated with the production of hydrogen. And so, when you're talking about certification and market transparency, when you're buying hydrogen, what is the associated emissions with that hydrogen? And so that's another issue. Trade is one side. The other issue for the IPHE members is to look at trying to develop a methodology or approach to the quantification of GHGs associated with the production of a unit of hydrogen. And so we just recently published a framework, a guidance document on 4 pathways: electrolyzers, natural gas with carbon capture and storage, coal with carbon capture and storage as well. And we're working on a byproduct was the fourth one. And right now we're looking at biomass. So these are just a framework approach on how it could be done. We are not a standards body, but the idea would be that the countries are coming together, and it's more than 10 countries are working together on this particular guidance document. And while nobody is required to follow any of the documentation particularly, but it's coming to consensus around how this could be done, and then go forward to a standards body such as ISO or someone to actually develop the standards. So this would be the initial step, and with a number of countries working on it, we hope that we can come to a consensus around that and move that forward quickly.
I mean, a consensus in itself is gold dust, isn't it, really?
Right. You bet. And yeah. So it is obviously it's a framework, and so you kind of have to get people's minds around what it means, and then move that forward to what's acceptable and what works with one electricity system versus another country's electricity system or monitoring system, etc. So what are the boundary conditions? How do you put that forward? So those are the conversations that are underway, because global market trade will require, and in the Global Hydrogen Review and elsewhere, you always see, understanding, they say certification, or at least understanding what you're buying on a global trade in hydrogen will be very important.
Yeah, that level of standardization is key, but what sounds very much like what you're working on at the moment is the most complex part, just trying to find common ground between countries that just have such vastly different agendas and vastly different needs, apart from, I guess, those 4 key points that you said at the beginning, and those unite. That they all varying degrees, like you said, but it unites them all. You said 10 countries that are dealing with this guidance document at the moment. Are they from a similar area, of a similar region, or can you share those country names with us?
Well, not the names, but I can say it's across the globe. And again, it's what's the driving interest for some? It's because they need the environment is driving them for sure. And so they need to understand that. For others, they view themselves as potential producers, and they want to be able to provide documentation as to the GHG emissions and others to sell. And so they understand that too. So it's right across the board, from the Americas to Europe to Asia. There are countries in all regions are interested, but they come with, as I say, with different lenses. Some are to meet certain goals. Others are from an environmental, from a trade and economy. They know that they need this transparency. So
and that's fine, because it gives it a much more multifaceted discussion process, doesn't it? It ticks off a lot more boxes of different points of views during the discussion. So when you do reach that consensus, it's essentially a true consensus. There's not going to be a huge amount of backtracking when somebody with a new point of view that should have been considered initially walks in and go, oh gosh, actually, we completely missed that key point. We better start again. So having that level of diversity and different agendas, I would see as a healthy basis for it. When do you hope for the biomass report? You mentioned the other 4. When would you hope the biomass one to be released?
Yeah, it's ongoing. I don't want to put a date on it particularly. The work has started, and again, it's and part of the key piece is to define the scope. And when you say biomass, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Definitely.
And so, is it waste or not? And there's all the issues that are associated. We've gone through. If you're familiar with the climate change kind of discussions around biomass and alternative fuels, etc. So a lot of work has already been done. So you can draw on that to make sure that let's focus on this particular area. So I don't want to get into the details particularly, because they're the conversations are underway.
Indeed. I think biomass is a little bit like a lot of other markets that are reaching far more of a mainstream spotlight, and that it's not new. Same with circular economy. Sometimes it's discussed in the prism that it's a brand new idea related to the energy transition and a lower carbon future, and it's not at all. It's just essentially been given, you know, a new burst of life with the global momentum that's happening. And there are many other areas. Carbon pricing is another area that I often hear talked about as if it's a brand new idea, and it most certainly is not. Just to pop over to Europe for a moment. I mean, Europe, when it comes to hydrogen, like I said before, is in a league of its own, and really fulfilling its potential. We'll just talk about the potential of green hydrogen at the moment. Like I say, we could talk on so many angles when it comes to what Europe's up to and its plans, but its full potential, along with renewable hydrogen, could save Europe $2.4 trillion up to 2050. Again, that's not a number to be sniffed at. How would you describe the demand pool that's necessary to draw in investments? I feel like Europe's not doing it's not having to work particularly hard to get those investments in. It's ticking all the boxes to help investors' confidence so far anyway, and it's got ambitious targets as well. What do you see anything else that would help them?
Well, I mean, the traditional response, regulatory certainty,
course.
You know, all these, there is early mover risks.
Yeah.
So how you know, there's all those usual affairs. And I think that there are some initiatives that are going on in Europe, but elsewhere as well, where the concept of hydrogen valleys, clusters, those kinds of things, where the demand, supply, and use are closely linked to try and manage some of that risk. Business risk is an important first step, an important step that's going on in Europe, but elsewhere as well. Europe's leadership is noted by all, but there's also been a lot of development in a different way. For example, there's more than 340 or 350,000 combined heat and power units installed in Japan. Fuel cell combined heat and power units installed in Japan. So they have been working on hydrogen and fuel cells for a long time, and their leadership through the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial is important. They have the bilateral relationship with Australia on the shipment of hydrogen from Australia already.
They had the blue ammonia shipment from Japan last year, from Saudi Arabia last year
exactly,
as well.
Exactly. So Europe definitely is making great strides, and the examples around the steel facilities, I think, are going to be key. Showcase sites that people can point to and use, and will be the start of the draw. But often the conversations, I think one of the key things is the offtake contracts. I think will be a very important issue. A number of countries are flagging, I think, in the Gulf region and elsewhere, obviously, the opportunities around producing hydrogen. I think producing hydrogen, clean hydrogen, however you want to define clean. But then it is, who are the off-takers, and what's that will build the business case. And so that's kind of a key feature that will have to be addressed now.
And we're certainly seeing those alliances, you know, in the Middle East, certainly seeing those start to be threaded or woven together. You know, Germany's been very public about its interest in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and India. India's got its own ambitions, and in terms of working with India, Russia as well has publicly stated it wants to get involved, and I mean there are many potential alliances as well that have been stated in the Middle East, and of course globally. And those hydrogen valleys as well, there's some of those that are hopefully going to be developed in South America, looking again at between those connection points, and I'm sure they will start to become far more common and far more woven into those hydrogen roadmaps. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but just before we do, I want to ask you one last question. You've got the 21 member states, and you were speaking in the beginning about very much trying to find those common threads between everybody and facilitating those conversations, finding, as I said, that gold dust consensus as well. I'd be keen to know, from your point of view, what would you, if you had to pick one challenge that is an overarching challenge going forward in this conversation that keeps popping up in conversations with member states, or keeps popping up in the partnerships and rolling things out, and you had to pick the #1 challenge that has to be given more attention, what would that be?
Yeah. Obviously, 3 or 4 things came to mind right away, which is
share all
the
4,
issue.
it's fine.
But I think right now it is the scaling up of projects.
The big S word.
There's been a lot of demonstrations. Demonstrations are very important, but there is innovation that goes when you go to scale, and that's going to be a key issue that. You mentioned all the projects and all the money that's been notionally announced.
Yes.
It's when you cut the check at a large scale project. That's the key feature.
That's
and so
the big
I
deal.
think that's the next big hurdle is, okay, we do have 𝗕𝘂𝘀𝗵𝗶 is great. We have some, in Europe with some of the steel facilities, that's great as well. So there's the start of that, but it is getting from moderate size into large scale production and consumption, getting that leap that will require innovation as well. That's the key feature, I think, that we're coming up against right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. We'll end on the S word. I think it's going to be the defining word of the next decade. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm sure the listeners are as well. And I certainly know GI will be keeping an eye on those 4 key themes that you mentioned at the beginning, and seeing how things progress and more consensus is built upon, and also keeping an eye out for the biomass report. That sounds very interesting. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope you join us again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.